Hey everybody, welcome back. Another video for you. Hope this is coming through okay. Had a couple of tech problems with the last video, but well, let's hope everything is working as it should. I want to talk a little bit today about the recent election in Italy. This is, of course, something that is dominating headlines internationally. Many pieces have been written about this, many people have spoken on it, but I think that it would be useful to just quickly talk through a little bit about what's happened in this election and what it actually means moving forward. Because, of course, I think that ultimately, all of this relates to some of these broader international issues that we've been talking about, well, for 6, 7, 8 months now. So let's talk a little bit about this victory. So, I mean, what can we say? The fascists have won in Italy. And by saying fascist, I don't simply mean it in a pejorative sense of the word. This is quite literally the inheritors of the fascist legacy of Italian political history. So let's just talk through it. Again, there are a lot of pieces that have been written about this from many different perspectives. I'm not going to pretend to be the definitive voice on all things in Italian politics, but in trying to run through it in just a few minutes and place it into the context of what's happening globally, I think we're going to begin to see why this is such an important and potentially historic moment. So anyway, the victory was for Giorgia Meloni. She is the leader of the so-called Brothers of Italy party. Now, the Brothers of Italy party needs to be understood as the inheritor of the legacy of Mussolini and of what eventually, well, without getting into all of the history, let's just say Mussolini is in control in Italy. Mussolini is arrested. He is then, sent into exile in northern Italy, where he is liberated by the Nazis and establishes what ultimately became the Italian Social Republic, so-called Italian Social Republic, which was based in northern Italy, more or less guaranteed by the Nazis up until more or less the 1945 and the moment that Mussolini is ultimately captured and summarily executed. So the history of the northern Italian political formation that comes out of that, this is the tradition that Meloni comes from. And we could go a little bit more specific and talk about, the Mussolini's Movimento Sociale Italiano, which ultimately then is succeeded by a series of political parties and various other political groups. I don't have time to go into all of the nuances here. There are street formations, violent street gangs, there are political formations, etc., all broadly making up the far right, the fascists in Italy, who in the post-war years were engaged in constant, I guess you could call it low level, low intensity conflict with communists and anti fascist partisans of various kinds. That led to the period in the 1970s that we refer back, retrospectively call the years of lead, where you had this ongoing political violence between the far right, the far left, and the police. This, of course, leads to, I guess, what you could call the sort of center left consensus that dominated Italian politics since that time. But anyway, let's move back and talk a little bit again about Meloni's party and how it sort of got here. So in 1995, the was the establishment of the Alleanza Nazionale, which was basically a rebranding of these former fascist parties that more or less had their reputations tarnished by years and years of violence. So you have this Alleanza Nazionale with this very kind of ambiguous, let's call it tenuous relationship with the fascist past. Some of it they repudiate and renounce, some of it they kind of still embrace. In many ways, they rehabilitate the fascist past, but they do it through social issues primarily, at least at this time. The fight against social gains that had been made by social movements in Italy in the 1970s, issues like abortion, divorce, things like that, women's rights, and other social rights that were the direct result of left wing struggle in the streets in Italy. So the Alleanza Nazionale fighting against all of that, the Alleanza Nazionale and the Brothers of Italy become obsessed, as we might imagine, over things like birth rates and demographics. They hyper focus on the issues of abortion and also migrants and immigration. I think we can, for those of us in the United States and in other parts in Europe, we can see how this falls into the broader trajectory of this fascist resurgence that we've seen in the last decade or so. The obsession with birth rates and demographics and migrants and immigration, this really dovetails quite nicely with the MAGA movement, with Brexit, with the AfD in Germany, with a lot of these same elements of the far right all over Europe. So, in that sense, we can place Italy and the Brothers of Italy into the same continuum. Okay, so the Brothers of Italy, they inherit two things actually from the far right. They inherit the street movement, which I've kind of sort of been mentioning here, the street gangs, the various fascist thugs, the groups, ties to the organized crime syndicates and other things. So that's all on one side. And on the other side is the other preoccupation that they have, which is with what's called presidentialism. And this is the question of the direct election of presidents versus the parliamentary system that exists in Italy and has existed now for decades. So ultimately, what this really is about is the Brothers of Italy want to suspend and remake the Constitution of Italy. They want to fundamentally transform the political character of the country. So, and this is a big issue. And they claim, and I think probably falsely, they claim that they'll be able to carry out this sort of presidentialist reform even without left wing coalition partners. That remains to be seen. Based on the election results, which although Meloni won, she won with a very small percentage, I think a mandate of like 30% of voters or something. So it's not really a mandate exactly so much as it is kind of a referendum on just how broken Italy's political system is and how voters to a large extent feel extremely disenfranchised. So let's talk a little bit about not so much the history of the Brothers of Italy, but maybe we could say the recent history that brought us to this moment here. So the Alleanza Nazionale is included in Silvio Berlusconi's first parliament, his first coalition government in the 1990s. This government splits over a number of factors, including tensions between the Alleanza Nazionale at that time and the Lega Nord. Now, we should mention the Lega Nord, or the Northern League, which then later rebranded itself to be just the League, or La Lega. Lega Nord is also a fascist political party that also traces its roots back to the Social Republic in the period of Mussolini, though that history is also a little bit more complicated. But in any event, these are fascists, xenophobic racists who have for years pretty openly been proxies for Putin and the Kremlin. Remember that the leader of La Lega, Matteo Salvini, has long been seen as a proxy for Vladimir Putin, even going so far as to show up to the European Union's parliamentary proceedings wearing a Putin T-shirt. So the big scandal that ultimately brought La Lega down, or shattered its popularity and led the Brothers of Italy to take the center place on the far right, is the fact that La Lega, and Salvini specifically, were implicated in a major scandal, taking money or trying to set up a scheme whereby Russian oil money would flow into their campaign coffers in exchange for sweetheart deals for these Russian oligarchs. So ultimately, La Lega kind of lost its position and is now essentially a junior partner to the Brothers of Italy in this very tenuous coalition that now exists between Giorgia Meloni and the Brothers of Italy on the one hand, Salvini and La Lega on the other hand, and Berlusconi and his forces as the third sort of junior partner in this coalition. So the collapse of La Lega led to the Brothers of Italy kind of sort of beginning to gain in popularity. But what really pushed it over the top and what ultimately catapulted the Brothers of Italy to this center position is COVID and the lockdowns. As we all remember, Italy was hit very hard in the first wave of COVID. That led to extremely restrictive kinds of lockdowns, which led to a certain degree of social instability and conflict. There were protests, there was anti-lockdown, anti-masking politics, etc. Naturally, as you might imagine, Meloni and the Brothers of Italy inserted themselves immediately into that conflict, taking a strong anti-lockdown, anti-mask, anti-vax stance. And that, of course, is extremely popular with a minority of the population, just as it is in the United States, just as it is in Britain, just as it is in Canada, just as it is in many other countries in the global north. And so you have a situation where the Brothers of Italy capitalize on the COVID, I guess you could say the politics of COVID, that then launches them into this period, this election cycle where Meloni wins and is now headed to be the first female prime minister of Italy. Now, of course, for representation purposes, people like Hillary Clinton say, "Oh, how great it is that Meloni, a woman, is, changing of the guard and so forth." But this is a fascist, okay? No different than other female fascists in Europe, like Le Pen. Who, speaking of Le Pen, I think now would make sense to talk a little bit about Meloni's her politics and what we know and or what we don't know. So Maloney describes herself. I've already mentioned about the domestic politics, the preoccupation with demographics and migrants, immigration. She has said repeatedly that she would use the Italian Navy to blockade across the Mediterranean, across Italy's territorial waters, to prevent migrants from Libya and elsewhere in Africa from, getting in boats and trying to make it to Italy for a better life. She wants to use the Italian military to blockade the country from that. It's not clear, A, whether she would actually do that, B, whether that would create bigger problems for her, and C, whether that's even legal. But leaving that aside, it sounds like certainly the kind of inflammatory rhetoric that is useful in a political campaign where you're whipping up your right-wing supporters into an anti-immigrant frenzy. But although she said all of those things, in recent months, she has signaled that she has openly stated that she is an Atlanticist. Now, think back to what our Red Brown Dugan friends have to say about what the word Atlanticist means, right? In their framing of it, in the framing of Kremlin cheerleaders, Atlanticist is anybody who wants to attack Russia and wants to defend the United States, the European Union, and NATO. An Atlanticist sees the world through the prism of U.S. imperialism, in other words, right? And so Meloni signals that she is an Atlanticist. So there's several indications of this. This is what her boosters point to over and over again in trying to justify the idea that she is an Atlanticist. One, when she was elected into the European Parliament, she chose not to affiliate with Marine Le Pen and the National Front, the French representatives in the European Parliament. Why would she choose not to align with the other primary far right female leader in Europe and instead align with various pro European conservative parties? Again, signaling likely an intention to run for higher office in the future, but more importantly, signaling that she is not one of the anti EU Eurosceptics of the far right, that she is pro EU. So she claims. Siding with Ukraine is another big indicator of Meloni's politics, at least right now, what is convenient to her right now, leading through the campaign and into what will ultimately be the first few days of her tenure as prime minister, siding with Ukraine, saying that they will not give in to energy blackmail from Russia, supporting price caps being put in place by the European Union, supporting the punitive sanctions against Russia, supporting Draghi and Macron's decisions to go to Ukraine, despite the fact that Draghi was a political opponent opponent for her. So there are a lot of indications that Meloni understands the politics, that the game of politics here on an international level, and that she will side with the United States and the European Union. At least that's what she is signaling. That's what she's been signaling throughout this campaign. That's what she is still signaling. I personally am extremely skeptical that that's actually the case. There's a couple of reasons why, not the least of which is the fact that Maloney seems to clearly be a project of Steve Bannon. There are connections to Steve Bannon. We don't have time to go into all of the details now, but let's just run through a couple of them. She has secured joint projects for events with the International Republican Institute. As we all know, this is the sort of National Endowment for Democracy, IRI, the sort of U.S. soft power arm of the Republican Party and of the sort of right wing of the U.S. military industrial complex and the U.S. imperial state. So she's doing events with the International Republican Institute. She was a participant at the Conservative Political Action Conference, CPAC, which, as we all know, is one of the preeminent fascist gatherings of U.S. political figures. She was, well, actually, last year when the Italian parliament took action to disband Forza Nuovo, which is a neo Nazi outfit that had been attacking left wing groups, including trade unions, Meloni rejected the vote, and I believe she actually abstained from that vote. So, again, demonstrating that while she can, kind of tack to the center when it comes to the talking points during the campaign, when push comes to shove and the vote is cast, she sides with the fascists. She seems to always do that. So the question really comes back to, what exactly is Italy going to be here? For the Europeans and for the Americans especially, Italy doesn't mean a lot in terms of the economics. Italy is not one of the top two, economies of Europe. Italy is in some ways economic and political basket case, but Italy represents a major element of the U.S. Western NATO strategy of building a kind of multilateral coalition against Russia. For his part, Putin has done everything he can to try to sow division in Europe. So for Putin, undoubtedly, they're uncorking the champagne bottles for Meloni because they understand that Meloni means conflict. She means political conflict within Europe. Now, whether that's simply rhetorical statements coming from an Italian prime minister who is a Eurosceptic and a fascist, or if this actually means that Putin expects Meloni to somehow hamper the sanctions regime, as has been the case with Orban in Hungary, with whom she is often closely associated, that remains to be seen. Orban has proven to be a fascist in his own right. He has proven to have sided with Putin on a number of issues, specifically with regard to gas. And by siding with Putin, I basically mean opposing the sanctions, not necessarily directly siding with Putin. But in any event, Meloni seems to be closer to Orban than she does to Macron. She seems to be more of a Eurosceptic than she leads on. And I think that there's going to be a lot more revealed in the coming days and weeks. Again, somebody who comes out of the milieu, the international fascist milieu that she does, a true fascist international with connections to all of the leading fascists globally, I think we should understand what this actually means. This is not a quote unquote Atlanticist. This is not a U.S. supplicant. This is not even necessarily, a political leader in her own right. This is an opportunist, somebody who has managed to use the right words and capitalize on a confluence of events. I don't believe Brothers of Italy rises to the level that they do if it weren't for COVID, if it weren't for, a number of other issues, this sort of perfect storm of factors that come together to allow Meloni to, assume this top position. In any event, we'll have to leave it there. Keep an eye on Italy because this is going to be a very interesting story in the coming months. I have a lot more to talk about in the coming days. Go over to the Patreon, patreon.com/Eric Draitzer if you're not already there, if you're not already subscribing. Thank you so much. Talk to you again next time.